Thank you all for checking out this week's episode. Once again, I'm John. If you like what you heard and saw today, subscribe to our YouTube channel, find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and check out our brand new merch store with hats, coffee mugs, t-shirts, other cool stuff coming down the pipeline. Again, thank you all for support. Be safe and see you next week.
How's it going, everyone? John here, the host of Spear Talk. And today we get to welcome iconic author David Morrell to the show. David is the author of, which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary this year, of First Blood. The first book I ever actually did a book report on, where the teacher said, "Can you pick another book?" For obvious reasons, but I'm glad they did it because I actually got to really dig deep and not horrify the rest of the student body. But you've also wrote some incredible other books, The Brotherhood of the Rose, in that series, The Fraternity of the Stone, The League of Night Fog. You're some really prolific comic book writing, Captain America, The Chosen, Spider-Man Frost, Savage Wolverine, Feral. David, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I guess one of the things before I even jump started, I know when it comes to a person like yourself that's super creative and still writing and still doing your thing, when the events of the last couple of years happen, whether it's a pandemic or a new war or rising gas prices, anything that affects the global populace, does that ever affect you creatively in terms of maybe you having to reset yourself or trying to figure out how to kind of navigate in this world? Does it ever put like a damper on your creative spirit?
Well, actually, you're raising a question which is going through the publishing world, especially for authors. And it's like the whole thing put together. There is greater publisher interest in social issues. And these days, gender and race are becoming themes that editors are very interested in because of, well, what happened with the Supreme Court in the United States. Gender is what everybody's talking about today, and the rights of gender and things like that. So it's affected me because I don't write, at least overtly, about social issues. If you look deep into the books, there are, like, for example, in First Blood, that's a story about a man who went to war and hated what it did to him. Now, that's not in the movies, except in the first one. The second and third movie look at this in a different way, but it's so you could say that if you look deeply enough, it was an anti-Vietnam War book.
Right.
But I don't think I mentioned Vietnam once or twice in the whole novel because, among other things, I believed that if you put contemporary references in, it affects how people read the book later. It sort of dates it. But anyway, to get back to your question, yes. And so I haven't published in a while. I'm writing. But what I've been writing has been more along the lines of what I've always done, except, I change genres sometimes, but it's still action and suspense. And so I haven't been comfortable submitting because I've anticipated that the response would be, can you add those themes into your book? And if I were passionate about this, I would. And I am passionate privately about this, but it's just not themes that I've found useful for me to explore.
I guess what I love most about the iconic character of John Rambo is, it's, for me, growing up, I was fortunate. I watched the movie beforehand, and reading obviously wasn't my strong suit. Like, I'm more engaged to the visual aspect of anything I do. But as I've gotten older and I go back and read some of these classics, and yours being one of them, it's the subtleness that you talk about. You don't really mention it, but the idea of PTSD or the mental health of some of these veterans that come back. And for someone like you that grew up in Canada, you didn't serve, but you were able to strike a chord with that generation of the Vietnam eras and veterans when they came back home and they had to kind of live with the repercussions of what they did in combat, whether it's good or bad. And I don't know if there's been a writer since then that's actually done that hasn't, like, you read a lot of books today, and I know you're great friends with Jack Carr and some of these prolific authors with the Green Berets, like these amazing war veterans and heroes, and they're able to write about this stuff because they've lived that life and done the training. For you to do Rambo in First Blood when you did at the time it came out, it seems like, were you ever scared? Was there any type of fear where it's kind of like, am I going to get this right? This idea of mental health and PTSD and this type of thing.
Again, a great question. And you mentioned that I'm from Canada. And I say that, I'm going to back up. I get a lot of questions about Rambo, but these are, and I can usually anticipate where the conversation is going to go. But again, you're taking me in a direction that I don't usually get asked about. So I was raised in Canada, and this is back during the Vietnam War in the 60s. And in Canada, communications being different than they are today with streaming and all this news sources, in Canada, there were two networks for television, and there was some American overlap, but a lot of it was Canadian content. And Vietnam was not something that was discussed. It was like, what's Vietnam? So when I went to the United States to study for my master's degree at Penn State in 1966, when people began talking about Vietnam, especially my fellow graduate students who were suddenly realizing they could be drafted, and they didn't know anything about Vietnam either, I began saying, what's this? And I had been told, and I don't disagree with this, I was a guest in the United States. It's like, if I'm a guest in someone's home and they have opinions that I don't agree with, I politely, change the subject, or we go on. I don't argue in other people's homes. And similarly, or even disagree violently, or even strongly. And similarly, as a guest in the United States, we have been told that we were guests when we crossed the border, and that, we should be polite. And I took that to heart. So I didn't say anything about my views about Vietnam. And after all, what could I have? What views could I have? It didn't affect me personally. But increasingly, I saw that the country was being affected in a way that actually scared me. I thought there might be a civil war. And this all happened in 1968 when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, when Robert Kennedy Jr. was assassinated, and when there were riots, and not 50 or 100, there were several hundred riots in the United States. Some were anti-Vietnam, some were about racial rights, to this day, some cities in the United States have not recovered. The inner cities of Detroit and Gary, Indiana, and LA still bear scars from those riots all these years later. And I remember thinking, whoa, there's something, and I thought, I need to write about it. And I'd always wanted to be a novelist, and now I had a topic. And what I was using was a war veteran from World War II, Audie Murphy, who people don't talk about much. His first name was spelled A-U-D-I-E, and he was America's most decorated soldier of World War II. And when I was growing up, he came back to the United States. He was an actor in cowboy movies. Some of them were very good. There's a movie I'm fond of called No Name on the Bullet, in which just the sheer presence in the movie and these eyes that had seen so much that just devastate anybody that he talks to. And he had a terrible time recovering from World War II. And he had written a book about his World War II experiences, To Hell and Back, and became a movie in which he starred as himself, which I don't know has ever happened. And then he was going to write another book about the difficulty of adaptation to peacetime, because he had what we now call PTSD in a big way. And the term really didn't become current until the middle of the 1980s, about the time that Rambo First Blood Part 2 came out. So there was no name for it in 1968, shell shock or things like that. Anyway, I used Audie Murphy as my model, and then because it's in my nature to do research, I did a lot of interviews. And as it happened at Penn State, I met a lot of, this would be 68, a lot of students my age who were back from Vietnam. And they were upset because I was their age and I hadn't been there. And I had to explain, I'm Canadian, I'm married, I have a child. This wasn't going to happen. And so they began talking to me about their experiences. And the novel really came out of that, of what I learned from them about what they had, their emotions when they were in Vietnam.
You mentioned this is kind of off subject here, but when you mentioned the eyes of somebody like Audie, and that like the fact they've been somewhere, they've seen stuff with these eyes, they've got that depth of those hollow kind of like eyes. What I love about the film adaptation with Stallone, those eyes, when you read the book, you're trying to picture what this person's going to look like if you've never seen the movie. And I don't know if it was the perfect casting or what the process was when it finally settled on Stallone, but some of those shots in that movie are like perfect. They match up perfectly with how you describe his eyes, and just even his dialogue. By looking at his eyes, you know he's going to say what he says in your book, whether it's the short clips, how he interacts with law enforcement. And it's just something, one of those things where it's like the 10 years between the book and the movie, was there any thought in your back of your mind was like, man, maybe this could be adapted? Or are you kind of just like, what's the perception going to be? Because spoiler alert, in your book, he actually gets killed. And there's also more of an interaction with the law enforcement, the sheriff, Tessel, compared to the movie. It's like, in those 10 years, are you kind of like, because I picture you not being the author to write a book thinking there's going to be a sequel or a third one or a fourth movie or whatever it is. This book is so packed. When you got the reaction it did from the test audiences and the reception to this character, were you kind of like, man, would you have changed the book up at all with that?
Well, I wouldn't change the book, but and you mentioned that Rambo dies at the end of the novel. Thematically, he has to, just as Teasel has to. There are no winners except the system, which is represented by the Richard Crenna character in the movies, Colonel Sam Troutman, and his name Sam is deliberately chosen because he's Uncle Sam, because it's the system. And in the first version of the film, Rambo dies as well. He commits suicide. And test audiences hated that ending, whether they would have liked my ending in which he dies and Teasel kills him. I'm sorry, Troutman kills him. Whether they would have liked that ending any better because the character was now somewhat reinterpreted from the novel. I don't know, but the producers who told me, I knew the producers well, Andy Vanya and Mario Casar, and Andy told me there were no plans for a sequel, that he was dead, and so they made a one-off, and then they had to go back and reshoot in order to have the new ending to satisfy a serious demand in test audiences. And then they said, oh my gosh, we can have a sequel. So, that by accident, in a way, turned out that way. Let's talk about Sly, because of the eyes. There's a lot here to talk about. Richard Crenna and I had many I've talked to Sly a lot as well, but this is important because Richard Crenna and I were talking about Sly as a movie star. And Richard had a very long career. He was a child actor and he had been in everything and he'd worked with everybody. And he said to me, and this was, not for an interview, we're just talking. He said that he had worked with all these people. And as far as he was concerned, only two actors, talking about male actors, not female actors, that only two male actors that he'd worked with ever knew what to do in front of a camera. There are lots of great actors who emote and interpret and what have you. But in terms of here is the camera and what do I do in front of it for the camera to be most effective, those two were Steve McQueen and Sly. And Richard had worked with Steve in Sand Pebbles. And what he liked about what they did is their eyes, that they were able to communicate with those eyes profound sections of dialogue that did not need to be expressed because it's movies. Richard also really admired their skill with props. They knew they had to do something in front of a camera, and Steve was always doing something and upstaging people awfully. The scene in Magnificent Seven where he and Yul Brynner get on a stagecoach, it's very funny with all the stuff that Steve does to upstage Yul. And with Sly, it was extraordinary that the eyes communicate the kind of depth of despair, as it were, that I wanted the character to feel in my novel, and which that aspect of the movie showed. So I gave you like 3 answers there, but I think they all fit together.
And I guess a question I've always had when it comes to novelizations of movies. Now, you actually never wrote a true sequel to, for obvious reasons, First Blood 2, 3, whatever the movie series is. When the movie go on for the sequels, part 2, part 3, and all this, when they approach you for a novelization, how much creative freedom do you have to kind of maybe fill in some gaps here? Or is a novelization in the true, whatever said in the movie, put it pen to paper so people can have, like, I don't understand the need for novelization as opposed to them just being like, hey, can you write the sequel, as if he still lived?
We have to remember what it was like in the 1980s before VHS tapes, before Blockbuster, before DVDs, before streaming. You could not, unless a movie was reissued in theaters, you could not re-experience the movie at will. Eventually HBO might show it, but of course in those days what you were looking at was this more or less square television screen, and so all this would be cut off on each side, and it was just an abomination of what the film had been, although we put up with it because that's the best we could do. So there was a market in the sense of a need, a desire for people who admired a particular film to want a novelization of it so they could use that novelization to, as it were, prompt them to replay in their imagination what they had seen. And the producers of First Blood, a company called Carolco, it's sometimes pronounced Carolco, but I always heard it pronounced Carolco. And they were brilliant marketers, and they knew that a novelization for Rambo 2 and 3 would be useful to them, partly because people would buy these and maybe see a reissue of the movie when it occurred. But more important, if we go back to the days of when malls were really populated and what are we going to do? Let's go to the mall. Like, who does that now?
Right.
And when we had bookstores like Dalton's and Walden's, who no longer in existence, but were hugely important in the book business and very popular in the malls. And books, if the bookstores would order the novelizations, which they tended to, they'd be in a stand like this. And what you had was it was like free posters for the movie, so it was people paying attention. So they felt it was important for promotional reasons to have the novelization. And what they discovered was that in my contract with them for selling the movie rights, I was the only one that had the right to create books about Rambo. So they needed me. And normally a novelization is simply a kind of retyped script where the dialogue would remain the same. I mean, this was really strict.
Yep.
And people who signed on to do these understood that they didn't have any freedom. And what they could do is describe a lot, and they could go into the character's thoughts and, expand on that. But if they wanted to add anything but a character's background, they had to get permission from the producers. Well, in my case, I especially when I received the script, they said, "Here, can you do this?" And the script, as I recall it, was not very long. It might have been 90 pages, and a normal script is maybe 115, or it can be longer, but let's around 90. It wasn't long. And the stage directions, this is a quote: "Rambo jumps up and shoots this guy. Rambo jumps up and shoots that guy." Okay. So I got back to Andy, is mostly the fellow that I dealt with. I like Mario, but I spent a lot more time with Andy. And I said, I don't know what to do. And I said, "I'm going to have to add a lot here, and you need to give me permission to do it. And I don't want to have to," because we were when this idea occurred, it was like a matter of months before the book had to be delivered in order to meet the deadline for the publisher and to get it out in time for the movie. And so what we agreed was that I would have unusual latitude. Now, one example. In the movie, Rambo is sent back to the POW camp that he escaped from because he knows the terrain, so that he would be best able to get in there and see if there were, in fact, POWs there. Because there was a big debate about whether, in fact, American POWs were there. And I'm reading the script, and he says, "Okay, I'll go back because I don't want to be in prison," or whatever his motivation was. It varied. And I thought, that's the last time there's any reference to this. But, in real life, this would be a big deal. He was tortured there. He escapes now for his freedom in that paradox. It's a wonderful idea. The paradox is, to get his freedom now, he has to go back to where he was held prisoner and tortured. Well, how's he going to feel about this? There is nothing in the movie about this. So I started digging in and adding scenes in which he has to come to terms with this. And then, in addition, the history of this is fascinating. The first script for the movie was written by James Cameron, who wasn't yet James Cameron. He had done Terminator, but he hadn't done all the rest of the stuff.
Yeah.
But I knew who James Cameron was because, I'm a movie geek. And I said, it's still kind of short. I don't know if I'm going to be able to give you a full book. Have you got anything else? Have you got stuff that was cut from the script or what have you? And he says, "Well, no, but there was another script." "Oh," he says, "yeah, by James Cameron." And I said, "Oh, send it to me." So what we got in the Rambo First Blood Part 2 novelization is like one of those wonderful experiments where I used 1/3 of the shooting script. I used 1/3 of me exploring Rambo going back to where he was tortured, and 1/3 of James Cameron's script, which begins in a mental institution. Wow. where Troutman gets out of a government vehicle, goes into this, and we have people staring at televisions, like immobile, or people literally basket weaving, and going down into the basement where there's an armed guard outside a metal door that has bars at the top of it, and it's locked, and it's dark in there. And the guard says, he broke the light again. He thinks he's the blank, blank Prince of Darkness. And I thought, this is great. This is really good stuff. And so I called Andy and I said, why aren't you using the Cameron script? And he said, no. Rambo can't seem like he's that emotionally disturbed. It'll distance people from the character. So we've changed it so he's in the road gang. They're blowing up rocks and he's shoveling rocks and all that. He says, so we changed it to that. Plus we got him to take off his shirt. So we had, these two things. So anyway, in the novelization was great fun to do because it was breaking all the rules and it was expanding the Rambo universe in a way that I felt was honest to the character. And it was on the New York Times bestseller list for 6 weeks, which hardly ever happens.
One of the interesting things about you is when you create these characters or these worlds that these characters exist in, you actually, whether it's the firearms training, survival training. I know one of your latest books, you became a private pilot just because a character in the book is like, how vital is that to your writing and creative process to actually get these skills that you have the confidence to now write about in said books?
Well, there's two schools of thought here. There are some very popular current thriller authors who brag about not doing research, who just, I made it up and that's the way it is and take it or leave it. And I suppose it's a viewpoint, but it isn't my way. In my youth, I thought it might be interesting to try to become an actor. And I was in a lot of plays and I had a lot of acting training. And I wasn't a method actor exactly, but I did think that if I was an author writing about, let us say, a courtroom, although I haven't really written about that, but I'll just use the example, that it might be useful to go to a courtroom and see what a trial looks like. Whereas in most movies and novels, how they have the scene where there's a witness, and the attorney actually walks over and puts hands on the witness box and leans forward. Well, the judge would find that attorney, he'd go to jail. You can't do that. The trial, the attorney must remain way back where they stood from, or with the podium. So that there's, using that as an example, there's no substitute for going out. If you're going to write about something, maybe you should observe it if you can. Maybe people would talk in a way that you hadn't imagined, or maybe things would happen in a way that you hadn't imagined, and that this was bound to add an element of reality to what you were doing. So in the early 70s, there's a school in Wyoming called the National Outdoor Leadership School, which is basically trains people how to respect the outdoors and to get along in a healthy way with them, I took a 5-week survival course. They called it a wilderness guide course, but basically it was a survival course. I've spent 5 weeks in the Wind River Range in Wyoming. We carried our food in because unless you're hunting, scavenging for nuts and berries expends more energy than you get from the food. You get vitamins and what have you, but you're going to die unless you're eating fish or you're eating meat that you shot. So I thought that was pretty useful, and I've had a lot of firearms training. And as we know, that this is in thrillers and crime stories, wretched firearms details are, one of the, I mean, you just say, come on, couldn't you have asked a few questions? There is a difference between a revolver and a semi-automatic pistol, and revolvers, unless they're specially adapted, cannot have sound suppressors on them because the sound would only go sideways instead of out this way. I mean, it becomes you're laughing because you know what I mean. So I had a lot of firearms. I had for a book called The Protector, I wanted to do a car chase as it would happen in life with professionals, as opposed to the guff you see in movies, where they ram against the back of the car, they bang this way against the sides. So I spent a week at the Bill Scott Raceway in West Virginia learning about car fighting and doing the spins and barricade, breaking through and things like that. And probably what you mentioned, the most challenging and interesting, I did a book called The Shimmer, which is about real life mysterious lights that appear near a town in western Texas called Marfa. And Marfa is famous in another way because the film Giant with James Dean and Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson was filmed near there. And these lights have been appearing for a very long time, as long as people, back in the late 1800s. And no one has been adequately able to explain them. They're probably a version of ball lightning, that the soil becomes electrically charged from the sun, and at night as it cools, it gives off a discharge. Whatever it is, these lights are magical. And in World War II, this is what interested me. In World War II, there was a Army Air Corps base there. This was before the Air Force was formed, where pilots were being trained. And they searched for the origin of the lights as an exercise. And they would fly out, these were planes where you could open the canopy, and they had paper bags with flour in them. And they would drop the paper bags at night where they thought the lights were originating. And then in the daytime, they'd go out and look for the blotches. I mean, this is cool. Yeah. And some of them said that the lights had chased them. And this was, I've said I'd go through genres a lot. And this was my sort of science fiction novel. I mean, it was about what the heck are these lights? And since aircraft were so important in the way they'd been researched, I knew I needed aircraft sequences. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that in many cases, non-pilots writing about aircraft in novels, you could tell it was wrong. So I took some lessons, and I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there's a flight school here, Sierra Aviation. And I took some lessons, and I took more lessons, and finally I said, oh, I've come this far, so I got my certification. And I use the planes a lot in the Shimmer. So it's been very interesting to do these different kinds of research.
For you to create a pop culture icon in John Rambo, I mean, just the book, never been out of print since 1972, over 30 languages translated. You have that part of your the part of the lore you'll always be a part of. But what I find interesting is when you kind of did some work with Marvel, you got to play in the world of other pop culture icons, whether it's Captain America, Spider-Man, even Wolverine. It's like, so what was that experience like there? And one of the coolest things that I saw in the interview you talked about, and I never realized it because I do love the comic books, you talk about the use of color on the covers and the pages, where it's like, if I'm going to write this character the way I'm going to do it, I need his colors to pop off, whether it's Spider-Man in snow or Captain America in like a Steel City where these colors pop. And it's like, how much creative freedom and fun was that for you to kind of jump into like another side of this whole pop culture lexicon?
Well, actually, comic book writers have a lot of freedom. I was approached by an editor at Marvel, I believe it was in 2005, and he said that they had this idea that it would be interesting for the creator of one U.S. military icon, Rambo, to write about another U.S. military icon, Captain America. And I loved the idea, and I'd not written comic books. And part of my adventure as a writer has been to, as with the novelizations, to try different things and different genres. So I had one problem. I didn't know how to write a comic book. And although I'd been fascinated when I was a kid, this really goes back, but in the 50s, as I was growing up, they would have actually stores where you could take comic books you'd read and turn them in, and they'd give you a limited amount of money for what you'd paid, or else you could turn them in for a credit, so that, if you gave them 3 books, they might give you the loan of 1. It was like a lending library. You could come, I went there every week. I just loved it. And the government eventually closed down the excitement of comic books in the 50s. They considered comic books to be ruining the morals of youth. So it you know how this works. And so it all got dumbed down. It took a long time until Batman, until the great Batman comics in the 80s, brought back that excitement. But anyhow, so they sent me scripts. And what I realized was that they weren't a whole lot different from a movie script. And except that what this was like, for movies, they sometimes have storyboards. More and more they use storyboards for movies so they can imagine what each cut will be. And so there's a drawing for each part of the scene. And I realized that basically this was stop action storytelling. It was a little bit like the storyboards in a movie. And that and what you do in the script is you can choose how many images are on a page. You can have 1 big image, you can have 2, you can have 4, you can have 6. If you get to 8, now the artist is going to have trouble, and you don't want to crowd your pages often, but sometimes it might be useful to do it. But each of those images has to be described, and often in detail. So I realized that from reading and talking about comic books and talking to my editor, that I could also talk about color. So in the comic book, the initial one I did a 6-part series for Captain America. And the first one, I wanted to hold off Captain America's arrival. And I wanted to have, as I recall, he's a Marine and a young man, and what's happening to him. And eventually Captain America will show up, and there are battles and what have you. It's about 16 pages before he shows up. And I stipulated to the colorist, because there are 3, there's the writer, there's the artist, and these tend to be in black and white, and then there's the colorist. Sometimes the illustrator and the colorist are the same, but not always. And so I wrote to the colorist, what I'd like is the feeling of grit on the page. I like the feeling that it's going to be brown, it's going to be sand, and except when the battles occur, and then we're going to have the bright, like the orange flashes of weapons, and we're going to have, if someone is hit, we're going to have the red of blood, but no blue. Until, because the sky was all muted, until we have Captain America showing up, and it was the first time I used a full page, so he would really hit us. And with, it's a little different now because comic books are released digitally. But if you think about a comic book, you turn the page.
Yep.
You turn the page. So what I thought of as the reveal when he showed up had to be on the turn.
Yep.
And we'd have the first full page, and it would be the first one with all the colors. So we'd have the red, white, and blue, especially the blue, because we'd seen the red already of Captain America's costume. And that was very exciting. And later, I had emails from the colorist who said that this was very exciting, that often he doesn't get any suggestions the text writer, and that this was like a true collaboration. We were all working together to try to create these effects. It was really very exciting.
We talked kind of about like the amount of research you do, and like when you started doing the research for like the 1950s London for one of your books and all this stuff, it's like how much time, when do you consider something fully researched before you start writing your ideas? Is this a continuous thing where you're taking out books or going to the library and doing your thing? Like how much time is put into the research before you feel confident enough to, when a reader picks up your book now, man, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's got the pulp down. He's got the gloomness of London. Like, at what point do you feel confident when you finally reach that point?
And again, a great question. This is the question for all historical novelists. And I've written a lot of historical. I did a historical Western called Last Reveille that's set in 1916 in Columbus, New Mexico, with Pershing's military expedition. We actually invaded Mexico in 1916 in hunting for Pancho Villa, who'd raided an American border town. Great fun to do. So I've done a lot of historicals, but the last three books that I've written, novels, were set in 1854, 1855 London. And so you can't go back to 1854, but there are parts of London that are still like that. Not a lot, because the bombing of London in World War II just destroyed a lot of things. But there were drawings from the period, there were photographs from the period, and there were, the documents from the period. And the novelist Dickens, is almost in some ways a documentarian about what London was like back then. So how I had the idea for the books that I would write these novels are about a man named Thomas de Quincey, who was the man who invented the concept of the subconscious. Freud lifted from him. And I thought it would be interesting and he was a dope addict. He was a laudanum addict, opium. And I thought it'd be interesting to have this man with the theory of the subconscious interacting with Scotland Yard, which had been newly created, and they were really thrilled to be making plastic casts of footprints. and here comes De Quincey talking about the chasms of the mind. So that was huge research. And I had to get to a point where I felt I knew how it would open. And I thought, all right, how do I get rid of all my assumptions about what has happens now? I'm going to have, it was in part in a theater. And I had to, a man passes through the lobby of the theater. And I had to do some research to find out what theaters were like back then. And then I had to find out what, he travels by cab. So what were cabs like back then? So a lot of it, this is very logical. And so there was a research of necessity to, what would the details be? So I'm not writing as a 20th century person or 21st century, but somebody who would be back then. And at the same time, doing all these other researches just to get a sense of the world. So it was kind of a catch-up kind of thing. I do the scenes, I do the research for the scenes that I knew I needed, and I'd get those minimal details so that I wasn't, being a goof. But then we had the bigger picture, and I had, to this side on my, I have a wall of books here about Victorians, and there's eventually we became friends. Her name is Judith Flanders, and she had written a book called The Victorian Home, and she'd also written a book called The Victorian City. And in it, she went through everything that would be in a Victorian home and what their schedule would have been and what the rooms would have been for. And so I could feel comfortable writing about, somebody going into a home. Mind you, she's talking mostly about middle class homes. And similarly, the Victorian city, how people got around. Like, I thought it was interesting because people did not have stoves as we understand them, unless you were very wealthy.
Right.
So one of the big businesses were called cook houses. And you would take cook shops, and you would go to a grocer and buy the food that you planned to eat that night, and you put it in a pot, and you would take them to the cook shop, and they would cook the meal for you, and you'd come back at whenever, and you'd pick up the meal and you'd take it home. Well, I thought this was fascinating, and you don't see this even in historical fiction. So anyway, I could go on forever talking about the Victorians, but it's a sort of, what do you need right now for the scene, and what do you need for the larger picture? So you're really getting a sense of what this world was like.
You have openly talked about the tragic passing of your son Matthew to cancer, and I don't know if this question is, you don't have to answer it, but I am curious. Did you notice he changed your writing before and then after his death in terms of the output? I mean, if you want to talk about Fireflies as well, I know. Again, you don't have to answer if you don't, but I am curious. For someone like you who's so prolific when it comes to the research and the training, even the writing itself, if there's ever a moment in time in that period where he did pass away, where you're kind of like, what am I doing? Like, was there ever a moment like that, or is this something where you're kind of like, man, he's so proud of you right now and he's loving everything you're doing, like he would be there right with you if he could?
Yeah, it's. I think it happened to me 3 times. That is to say that the work changed. If you look at the books before Matt died in '87,
Yep.
there's a theme of a young man looking for a male authority figure to admire, and almost always being disappointed. And my father, I'm old enough that my father fought in World War II. He was a naval pilot and was shot down over France a few days after the start of the
Wow.
D-Day invasion. And I never knew him. And my mother was forced to put me in an orphanage for a time and in a foster home. I lived for a time on a Mennonite farm, and that was really interesting. And the man who, it shows you how you have an imprint. The man who was the owner of the farm was named Wilfred Shantz, and it is no accident that in First Blood, Teasel's first name is Wilfred, because it's that and Wilfred Shantz, I liked him a lot, but he was a tough guy. And it was from him I learned to count. I was maybe 4 years old, and he insisted that everybody chew 50 times before they swallowed their food. So I learned to count to 50. I mean, this is a tough world, right? And yet people admire how slowly I still eat, because I was imprinted. And in Brotherhood of the Rose, we have, think about this, 2 orphans. Oh, my heavens, what a surprise, given that I was in an orphanage, who are sort of befriended by a man who says, I can't be your father, but I can sort of be your father. And I should add that my mother remarried, and the stepfather and I did not get along, and he didn't like children. And so I'm sort of imprinted to seek out male authority figures as a substitute for a father, but in many cases I was disappointed. On the other hand, I had writers such as Sterling Silliphant, Philip Klass, Philip Young. These are people I've written about who encouraged me as a writer and were everything I would ever have wanted in a father. And to this day, I'm influenced by them. And in Brotherhood of the Rose, it's the betrayal of the foster father that leads to the ultimate climax. And then Matt got sick, and he died as I was finishing the 3rd book in the Brotherhood of the Rose series, which is all about young men looking for for those wonderful father figures. And things changed. So now I was an author looking for a son.
Yeah.
So you see in the books in the 90s, a character who now is, in fact, I was overt. There's a book called Desperate Measures that I wrote, not to be confused with a movie of the same name, in which a newspaper reporter, a very good one, his son has died from the same cancer that killed my son. And he has had a breakdown, and I sort of had one. And he's now so low that he's now writing obituaries. That's what they've done. That's all they think he's good for. And I always loved the idea, the research he does for an obituary causes he's writing obituary about a man who isn't dead yet, a famous man. But what he finds out causes the death of the man that he's writing the obituary about. So, I mean, isn't that cool? Yeah. But through the whole thing, what he is he's haunted by the death of his son. And that went on for a while. It moderated. And then in 2009, my granddaughter, Natalie, died from the same rare bone cancer that killed Matthew. And that's only 200 people get the disease in the United States each year, and it is not believed to be inherited, but there isn't enough research to know. And so one of the reasons I wrote the Victorian books was I just couldn't bear the modern world anymore, and I wanted to disappear into 1854 London. There's a book by Jack Finney called Time and Again, in which a character imagines so hard that he goes back to New York City in the 1890s. And there's a Richard Matheson book, Bedtime Return, which is the same theme about a man going back because he just concentrates hard enough. And that was me. So because of Natalie's death, I was writing about a long ago time that I wanted to disappear into. But, we talk about the psychology of an author. Someone pointed out to me, De Quincey, when I started writing about him, was 69. And that was when I started to do the research, when I was 69. And De Quincey had a daughter named Emily in real life, who was his keeper, so to speak, because he was an opium addict.
Yep.
And somebody pointed out to me that Emily basically was Natalie.
Wow.
And that I had somehow, and I didn't realize it when I'm very aware, but this one went right by me, that I was, not that I'm an opium addict, but that I was the elderly man. And now it wasn't the searching for the son, it was searching for the granddaughter. So, when you write a novel, if you open yourself up rather than doing the same thing again and again and again, inevitably what you've been feeling will come through and control the source of, the kind of material that you want to write. But that, to me, I get chills thinking about it, that, by the time Murder as a Fine Art came out, Emily in the book is about the age that Natalie would have been if she had lived.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, and I don't mind talking about these things because in the United States, it has been my observation that men do not handle grief well, that they want to swallow it and hold it in, and they're tough and, I can get through it. And the cost is usually either an alcohol problem or else a marriage problem if they're married. I've seen a lot of marriages break up because people grieve in different ways and don't recognize the need to, in fact, grieve at all. So I had written a book called Fireflies, as you noted, which was mostly for the grief community, but other people found it interesting and in ways helpful to talk about these powerful emotions and how you can either deny them and have a lot of trouble, or else you can work with them and try to understand them. The grief, it still hurts, but I don't know. People have told me that Fireflies was of help to them in understanding what they were feeling.
Well, it's one of those things too, and you kind of hinted at it. The idea is, especially being a male, like the stigma of not asking for help or just bottle up. It's like, it's interesting that you as a writer, you could have just as easily, the irony of that would have been you not writing about it, but writing about something else. But the fact you were able to tie that into almost like a form of coping mechanism at some points, you didn't even realize you were doing it. And that's why I love Fireflies. And if anyone has a chance to read that, I mean, it's the idea of grieving. It's something we all go through, and it takes a lot for you to, someone like you, to put that out there. Because it's like, I created John Rambo, I created whatever, I wrote Wolverine or Spider-Man, but it's like now you're writing about you, who in turn could be a hero to someone else, because you are talking about the same stuff that they are dealing with themselves.
The idea was that if the creator of Rambo could talk about these really tough emotions, maybe other people would talk about them as well. And in fact, there's a parallel to this. When First Blood, the film, came out, I was doing book signings. There were several men who came with their wives. They said they were Vietnam veterans, and they wanted the book signed. And I was very grateful that they liked the movie and that they wanted to read the novel. And many of them knew the novel. But it was made vivid to me when some of the wives would linger and say that the book had helped their marriage, or the movie had helped their marriage, because they'd been in Vietnam in combat. Because mind you, it couldn't have been fun in any case, but it must have been worse to be in the jungle and have all and hell happening. And they said that he never talked about it, that he was always, that he repressed it so much that he wasn't the same, and it wasn't a good marriage. And that after they saw the movie, they'd gone, some of these, this is a couple of conversations, so individual guys going home and crying. And suddenly talking about, they in effect had identified with Rambo, and especially the speech at the end, and that they had, which is not in the novel. This is it's just, there are differences and similarities, but that the movie had encouraged them to finally, that scene with the kid with the shoebox, the shoe shine box, and the bomb in it, and what had happened when it went off, and that they talked about it, and that the marriage was better because he wasn't moody as much, and he had allowed himself to express it. And words are a powerful weapon, and I believe that when we have really terrible things happen to us, the more we talk about it isn't going to inflame us to repeat the experience. In fact, it's going to dull the experience, because the words create a buffer. And the more we talk, of course, we can get pretty boring about it to other people, but the more we talk about it, the more the scar tissue builds up. So words are just a terrific coping mechanism.
Before I let you go, David, I know your website's awesome with all the information, and you even parts of the website where you talk about your history with the Rambo knife, and which it's a whole other, I could talk 2 hours about that.
Well, we can talk about it a little bit more unless you have time.
No, I mean, I guess I just don't, the one thing I've always been interested about with the lexicon of the actual knife itself, and like how it was portrayed, where it became larger than life almost. And I just love the little details in the book about the specific knife, that to actually see it in the movie to become what it is today. It's like, it's something super, it just, even other movies reference that knife, and it's like the pop culture power of that. It's crazy how a simple knife has the lasting power it does, how it fits that character so well.
Well, it's more than a simple knife. As you know, I'm a fan. I talked to Jimmy Lyle. I never had the honor of meeting him, but he and I had conversations as he told me about the knife. And then Gil Hibben, who did the knife for the third and fourth film, he and I met in person, and we're friends, and we often talk on the phone. But for fun, let's go back to 52. and a Warner Brothers movie that stars Alan Ladd called The Iron Mistress.
Yes.
And this is something everybody who admires the Rambo films should see. It's not a very good movie, but in it, Alan Ladd portraying Jim Bowie at one point needs a knife, and he's whittled this wooden knife, and he goes to a blacksmith whose name is Black, and in real life his name was Black. And he has the knife created for him. Now, no one knows exactly what the Bowie knife looked like, but the Warner Brothers researchers had, looked into what knives were like back then and what would have been useful and what also might have been probable for the Bowie knife. And they came up with the Iron Mistress, which is gorgeous. Yeah. It is so, so beautiful. And it inspired Jimmy Lyle when they saw it, and then inspired Gil Hibben. They were kids when that movie came out, and they went crazy saying, wouldn't it be great to make a knife like that? And they weren't the only ones, but those are the two famous ones that I have met. They told me many, many knife makers, it was the Iron Mistress. So when there is no knife in my novel, and knives weren't on my radar in 1968, but Sly was a collector, and he had the idea. It was his idea. Again, Richard Crenna talking about what to do in front of a camera. He needed a prop. He needed a knife. I know, a knife. So he had thought of having Jimmy Lyle design a new version of the Randall survival knife. And it would have the jagged edge, and that was, as I recall, a aviation survival knife, so that you could cut through the saws on it, where you could cut through the fuselage of a downed aircraft if you had to. And it had the hollow, with the compass, and it had the stuff in it, and different screwdrivers, like Phillips and straight on the hilt, and and what a brilliant knife. And so Jimmy designed it for Sly, and then somebody had the idea, let's do a collector's edition, 1 through 100 numbered, for $1,000 each. And by God, they sold. No, this had never happened. No, it couldn't, how is this possible? And I found out later through friends at Blade magazine that the cutlery industry, as it was called, was it was lethargic. And the First Blood knife revitalized the cutlery industry, and suddenly people were making knives again. And then, of course, Jimmy did the knives for 2, or the knife for 2. Actually, there's a dagger too, bigger, of course, And then, God bless him, Jimmy died, and Gil made the larger knife yet in the machete for 3 and 4. I mean, to me, these are very exciting. These are gifted artists who took a practical item and made it beautiful. And Pauline Kael, you mentioned how much I mentioned these in my novelizations for Rambo 2 and 3. And at the start, I say, I even gave, this is before the internet, I gave Jimmy's and Gil's address at the start of the book. If you were interested in, and I had drawings of the knives in the books that they gave me, and I had, a page of description and what they could do and how beautiful they are. So, I had that I just have to laugh at the beginning. And so Pauline Kael, the great movie critic who worked for the New Yorker, she did a review of Rambo 2. And she mentioned that she'd received the novelization, and at the beginning, how I described these works of art. And she says, I can hardly wait for my set to arrive. Oh, God.
One of the interesting things, every time a movie is or a book is turned into a movie, everyone's like, "Oh, the book's always better." And a lot of times, I'm a huge fan of Michael Crichton, so Jurassic Park, Sphere, all that stuff. A lot of times, people are like, "Ah, the movies, they're good movies, but it's not as good as the book," and I can kind of attest to that. So, I guess my question to you is: are there parts of the movie that you looked at as a viewer, and obviously the creator of the character, the First Blood idea, that you were like, man, I wish I wrote about that. I really like how they did that. Or is this something where it's kind of like, hey, at least now because of this movie, people could go back and actually read First Blood?
The knife, certainly, I wish I'd thought to add the knife. And it just wasn't, I'm writing in 1968, 69,
Right.
and it just wasn't, even though I'd seen The Iron Mistress, right? But it wasn't, it just wasn't there. And I would certainly have added that. The movie, I think, where and we should say that fans might want to look at closely at their Blu-rays and 4Ks and even the DVDs, because I recorded a full-length audio commentary for the film, and it is on these. And in it, I talk about, I mean, who would have thought that a novelist would be
Right.
asked to record a commentary for a movie? And in it, I talk about some of the things. Well, we've talked about a lot of different things that I haven't talked about before, but a lot of the background for the film and the novel and the differences and how I feel about it. It's a wonderful film. I mean, it interprets the character differently. In my novel, he's furious about what war did to him.
Right.
In the novel, he's a victim. I'm sorry, in the movie adaptation, he's a victim. Now, that's different from the character in 2 and 3, where he's a different Rambo again. And in 4, he's a different character again. In 4, Sly phoned me. We talk on occasion. And he phoned me to say for 4 that he had been uncomfortable in retrospect about the glorification of combat in 2 and 3. And that he wanted to make it more realistic. And he was going to do a Sam Peckinpah Rambo 4, and going back to the tone of my novel. So in a way, Rambo 4 is sort of closer to my novel than any of them, but it's kind of interesting to see how they all work out. But I would like to have seen more, if we were going to do it again, I'd like to see more of the policeman, more of the police chief, because in the novel he gets equal time. It's Rambo, Teasel, Rambo, Teasel, Rambo, Teasel, as they're looking at each other. And I'm a Quentin Tarantino fan, and Quentin released, he's in the book business now, and he released a novel version. It's not a novelization because it's so different, a novel version of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And it's a wonderful book. I loved it. So when he was promoting it, he was on radio and TV a lot. And people said, well, what would you like to make? You've got one movie to go. What would you like to do? And he said, to my great delight, but also, as I explained, disappointment, he said, if I were going to do a remake, it would be First Blood.
Yep.
And then he talked about the novel in ways that indicated to me that he'd actually seen the book and what he would do to add elements of the book to the movie. But then, and he talked about the dialogue, and, I was really flattered. And he did this a couple of times. But then, of course, he emphasized, this is the disappointment part, that he doesn't do remakes, but that, it had been on his mind. So anyway, that it's on its own, it's a really good film. And it gets better with time. The issues become more upfront, and the photography, the direction, and the fact that there's no CGI, that the stunts are actual real. Somebody was saying the Tom Cruise Top Gun Maverick film, everybody's saying, oh my God, it's so wonderful, they don't use CGI. As a friend of mine said, yeah, this will be the new This will be the new promotion for films, real stunts, real locations.
Right.
I mean, movies have gone so far toward cartoons, and but First Blood, it feels real. I have a lot of respect for it.
Now, obviously, it's the 50th anniversary this year of First Blood, the 40th anniversary of the film. I know the filming location up in Hope, they're doing their big kind of anniversary thing this October, I believe. But any plans for you to kind of get out there and celebrate these? Or at this point now, is it just like these are just dates to you?
No, they're very important. I mean, and someone pointed out that if you look at novels that became movies in the thriller world, I mean, it's a pretty cool 5 character thing. Characters came out, and you got Sherlock Holmes, you've got Tarzan, you've got James Bond, you've got Rambo, and you've got Harry Potter. That's in the 20th century. And wow, I mean, what a great adventure that has been to have to move. And if Indiana Jones never was in a novel, we have to be distinct here about the characters from novels to movies. And I mean, it's not, few writers have a chance to be as impactful and enduring as I've been able to do with this character. So it's very exciting, and the interest doesn't wane. The sales of the book are increasing. I mean, it's just a thrill to know that more and more, and like it's never been out of print. I think the last edition came out 4 years ago. So I mean, and it's most books don't last that long. And I just add parenthetically, because you mentioned Brotherhood of the Rose, and those books, they've never been out of print either. The Brotherhood of the Rose was published in 1984, and it remains in print, and it just keeps, and other books too, it just keeps going along. And in fact, there was a movie option for Brotherhood of the Rose recently. So I mean, it's cool to be able to have a body of work that is still vital in a profession where it often fades into the past pretty quickly.
I think one of the cool things too is like every time I go to like a yard sale or flea market, I love old books, specifically ones I grew up reading. But every time I can buy a copy of First Blood, or it's the different book covers, or even like the old school posters from different countries, there's something insane to me that, like, again, for 50 years, this thing is just as prevalent as I mean, it's just crazy that Stallone is still a champion of the character. That you're out there being a champion of the character. It's still staying the test of time, and people are still drawing pictures of Rambo. Or it just, for me, it's just crazy how it covers. Yes, it's got the sensible topics of mental health and PTSD, but like he's just a great. And obviously, I was portrayed as a hero. It's just an everyday American soldier that get put in this crazy situation. How he comes out of it or doesn't come out of it based on what edition you're reading. Again, it's just really surreal. It's so fun to me just to see kids where I'm 37 now, where I have cousins who are 10 and 12. They're watching Rambo now. They're like, oh, I can't wait to read the book, or I can't wait to. It's just like, it's cool how generationally this thing's going to stand the test of time.
It's unreal. And I talked to Sly about this once, and because Rambo is mentioned a lot in popular culture every day.
Every day, Jeopardy, everything, Wheel of Fortune, like everywhere.
And newsreels, not always in a good way. It's almost a litmus test as to where you are. I was saying to him, this is unreal, and he was saying the same thing, that we'd be watching something on TV, a news program, or maybe a movie. I have to laugh in Die Hard when Bruce Willis is doing his thing, and somebody, I think it's Alan Rickman, says to him over a walkie-talkie, "Who do you think you are, Rambo?" And you just have to laugh. And we both agreed that we, as members of the public watching culture evolve in front of us, that we would see Rambo mentioned almost as some objective character or name, and then there'd be that click where, well, wait a minute, we did that, that came out of us. And I love to tell this story. A lot of this wouldn't have happened if not for my wife, who way back when I was a graduate student, and God, we had nothing, and 25 cents was a big deal. And she had been somewhere and seen some apples being sold that were grown locally, and she brought the apple home, and I was working on the novel. And I didn't have a name for the character, but the character had to have a strength to it, And in the novel, in fact, he doesn't have a first name. It's just that last name. And I was writing, it was a Saturday afternoon. It's emblazoned in me. And she said, I bought this apple. It's pretty good. Try it. And I'm typing like, the genius, And so finally, just to settle it, I said, all right, give me the apple. And I bit into it. And I said, what everybody says, it tastes pretty good. What's it called? It's what you always say with an apple. And she said, it's a Rambo apple. And I said, what? And she said, a Rambo now, spell it, R-A-M-B-O. And if you're in central Pennsylvania, most people have never heard of the apple, but they have in central Pennsylvania. And because I'm a student of American history and literature, and it's fascinating to me that Johnny Appleseed, whose real name was John Chapman, when he went through in the 1800s to Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana planting apple trees, they were Rambo apples it's a Scandinavian kind. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Well, David, this has been amazing. I can't thank you for taking the time today. Before I let you go, obviously your website's awesome. It's got all the information to reach out to you and just figure out what you're doing and some of your bio stuff and your history of everything. Some awesome pictures. If people want to reach out to you, is that the best way? You have other social media you like to direct people towards?
I'm on Twitter. At the moment, I can't tell you what the handle is. The website is davidmorrell.net, not .com. There's a photographer named David Morrell who has the .com. So it's .net, but that's pretty cool because it's a network of readers.
Yep.
You can think of it that way. And there's a lot of stuff on the website. There is a Rambo page, which has a number of items on it. There's a very long interview which talks about things like the Rambo apple. And there are some rare posters and one with, because Kirk Douglas was originally going to be Colonel Troutman, and I had the poster before Richard Crenna took over. And so there's the Kirk Douglas poster, and also some photographs of me with Richard and Sly, and it's a fun site. There's a lot of ways you can dig. It's almost like a magazine in some ways.
Yeah.
I was on Facebook, but I found it after a while to be more that I was doing it so much that it was interfering with my writing, and also I took a break from it. I may go back, but I am on Twitter every day.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for the time today.
I thank you, and very interesting questions. I mean, this was a different way of approaching some of these topics that I thought are very valuable.
Awesome, thank you, sir, and we'll have to do it again someday.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
How's it going, everyone? John here, the host of Spear Talk. You might not know this, but before I record an episode, I like to break a sweat. And I do that using the Chop Fit. Over the course of the past year, the Chop Fit has allowed me to lose weight, tone up my body, and feel even more amazing about myself. A feeling that you should all feel about yourselves as well. If you use this code, SpearChop10, you get $10 off your order. Once again, use code SpearChop10 for $10 off your Chop Fit order. It'll change your life. Thank you.